Hi everyone, I hope this video finds you well. This is, again, the Jewish history class at Flagler College. And we're going to continue our discussion about the Holocaust today, getting into the period of the Second World War itself, which of course changes everything for the Jews, as if it wasn't bad enough. Under German rule, this totalitarian regime extends its hold over much of Europe, and the Jews are the primary ones to suffer as a result of that. This is not to say that others did not suffer or were victimized. Millions of people were directly victimized, put into camps, killed en masse by the Germans, but the Jews were singled out, of course, for particular extermination. The Germans really behave in ways here, I should say the Nazis behave in ways that go at times against the interests of the war to exterminate Jews, which is one of the more puzzling aspects of the Holocaust, and really just crystallizes the idea that this was of primary importance to the Nazis. The Germans began World War II by invading Poland in September of 1939. And the Polish army put up a spirited fight for a few weeks, really just a few days, maybe 3 weeks or so before they succumbed. Poland was taken over and occupied. Of course, this led to France and Britain declaring war on Germany, but they didn't take any direct action necessarily to, they didn't send expeditionary forces immediately to Poland, and really Poland, it took some time to organize all of that. So Poland succumbed really quite quickly, despite putting up as much of a fight as they could against what was at the time easily the biggest war machine in the world, most effective war machine in the world. And once Poland was now they did this, of course, with the collusion of the Soviet Union, due to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a secret agreement between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. They agreed to divide up Poland, really to go back to Poland as it had existed, at least to some extent, before the First World War. And let's remember, Poland was really only recreated in 1918. Or 1919 via the Congress of Versailles. Poland had been divided up for more than a century between Prussia and Austria and Russia, and really the Russians and the Germans still felt that they should control Poland. There were large populations of Germans and Russians living in both in Western and Eastern Poland, respectively, and so this was all part of the Nazi goal of achieving Lebensraum or living space. But that, of course, would be extended, and so the eastern part of Poland was taken over by Soviet Russia. The western part, really the bulk of Poland, was taken over by Nazi Germany, and this put several million Jews. Probably between 3 and 4 million Jews under the direct control of the Nazis. Of those, perhaps 3.5 million, only about 500,000 of them would survive the war. Just to give you a sense of the demographic impact on the Jews, specifically in Poland. By far the largest Jewish population in Europe lived in Poland before the Second World War, and by far the largest population of Jews who were killed during the Holocaust were Polish Jews. But Polish Jews were not of a single stripe. There were highly urbanized, very assimilated Jews living in places like Warsaw and Krakow and Łódź and Lublin and these major cities. And then there were the Jews of the Shtetls, living in the countryside, often very different in cultural makeup from their urban brethren, so to speak. Of course, the Nazis didn't treat them any differently. They made no distinctions between urbanized, assimilated Jews and kind of these rural, more traditional Jews, and crowded them together in ghettos and eventually killed them all in extermination camps. In the early stages of the Nazi occupation of Poland, there's a great deal of uncertainty, and you can see this in the diary of Adam Janjakov, which you're assigned to read in this course. You can see this in many other sources. One that I assign in my historical methods course, which is on the Holocaust, is the diary of a teenager living in Łódź. That's the name of the town, spelled Lodz, with lots of diacritical marks on those letters. It's pronounced Łódź. But he was a very bright, promising young lad of 14 or 15 at the beginning of the war, and he talks about, he started keeping a diary actually before the war started. He talked about going to summer camp, talked about how excited he was for his school classes, and it's really somebody that I think anybody can identify with, right? If we recall our teenage years, it's, he has the same sorts of concerns that we probably all did. But once the Nazis take over, he's like, well, what's this going to do to my school? Am I still going to be able to go to school? I mean, he has very typically teenage concerns. And as time drags on, he becomes less and less concerned with these sorts of things and more concerned with, how am I going to eat, right? I mean, he's a teenage boy. His appetite was tremendous, and he had no food, and he was starving to death slowly. This tore his family apart. And you can really see this descent into darkness. And you can see that, I think, in the Janjakov source as well, though from a very different perspective. He was, unlike David Sirakowiak, the teenager, Adam Janjakov was already an established leader of the Jewish community. He was assimilated. He was highly educated, accultured. He was an engineer, and thought about things in a rather scientific fashion, actually. And you can see still the puzzlement, like, what are they going to do to us? And they're saying I have to do these things, and they've appointed me to be the leader of the Jewish community, and he's trying to work kind of with the Germans to make sure the Jews are okay. He adopts a policy of appeasement, in a sense, right? But he simply, he's not operating with the benefit of hindsight. Personally, as I read this thing, I'm saying, please run. Find some way to escape. Tell everyone to escape. Tell everyone to resist. You're all going to die. But of course, he didn't have that perspective. And so these sources can be really difficult to read, especially because we know the end, so to speak, right? We know what happened to most of these Jews, but it does give a sense of kind of the development of this, as I said earlier, the descent into darkness. The Germans almost immediately talked about creating Jewish ghettos in the major cities. This didn't actually happen until somewhat later. So they take over Poland in September of 1939, and through the year 1940, and in some cases even into 1941, they are building the ghetto, meaning they are cordoning off a section of these major cities like Warsaw. Well, these are the major ghettos I have listed here: Warsaw, Łódź, Krakow, Lublin, and once they start Operation Barbarossa and attack the Soviet Union, they create ghettos in places like Lvov and Bialystok, and these places that had been part of the Soviet occupation zone as well. These, and you can see here on the picture on the bottom left, they literally just built a wall, like right down the middle of the street, and everything on this side of that wall was part of the Jewish ghetto, and everything on the other side was part of Warsaw. This is of Warsaw. In some cases, there were streets that were major thoroughfares, and these had to remain open for foot traffic and even in some cases car traffic, because they were such major thoroughfares. And so they would make the Jews wait, and they would have gates, and they would close the gates, and sometimes Jews were waiting upwards of a half hour or an hour just to cross the street. In Warsaw, they built a footbridge over this major thoroughfare that split the ghetto in two. You can see here, Jews being rounded up and forced into the ghetto. And it looks like a mixed group here. Some maybe rural Orthodox Jews, and some, from the urban space. Uh, and so, into these ghettos went everyone. They rounded up entire villages of Jews from in rural Poland, and took them into Warsaw, or took them into Krakow, and forced them into these ghettos, to the point that the Warsaw Ghetto, I think at the height of its population, had about a 500,000 Jews living in it, 400,000 to a 500,000. And that meant roughly 13 people per room inside the ghetto, right? So this was only a small section of the city, and the living conditions were absolutely horrific. And they gave rations of food to those who had jobs, but those rations of food were meager, and the average number of calories afforded to a ghetto resident was something around 150 calories or something like that, 150 to 200 calories per day, which of course is not enough to survive for very long. And so there was a thriving black market. There were Jews smuggling food into the ghettos. Jews who would escape out, climb the wall or tunnel under it, or go through the sewers or whatever it was, to find food, bring it back in some cases mark it up, charge rather high prices for it to other people living in the ghetto, right? So it's a whole ghetto economy that's reliant on the black market. But even still, the portions were meager, and people were slowly starving to death. And the Germans, as they did with just about everything, this is part of the Nazi system that is most disturbing and most troubling. They would make demands, and then they would place the responsibility for fulfilling those demands on the leaders of the Jewish communities. And in the ghettos, this was the so-called Judenrat, the Jewish Council. And this is where Adam Janjakov comes in, because he was, of course, the head of the Judenrat in Warsaw. And you can read in his diary how terrible this responsibility was for him, how time-consuming, how exhausting this was. I mean, this guy seems never to have slept, at least not for very long. He was constantly, fielding questions, having people approach him with concern, seeing what he could do. He was especially concerned with the plight of orphans and children, and the disabled, right, who really had no place to go. They couldn't be taken on as workers, and so they didn't have the protection, the meager though it was, that work offered to ghetto residents. And we can corroborate this again with other sources, with the journals of Emanuel Ringelblum, who was the head of an organization called Oneg Shabbat in the Warsaw Ghetto, a kind of resistance organization. And also, the diary of David Sierkowiak and others who lived through the ghetto situation, and see that, the responsibilities were just horrible for these people. Zhernikov ended up, as you should know by this point, committing suicide when he was given the responsibility of liquidating many of the children, thousands of children from the ghetto. And by liquidate, we mean, herd them onto transports to be sent off to death camps. And by that point, it's pretty obvious to people who were living in these ghettos, especially those in leadership positions, that, when they're liquidating, when they're sending people off, they're not sending them off to some, work situation somewhere else, as they were promised by the Nazis. They're sending them off to die in these extermination camps. The word spread enough that was pretty obvious. And the ghetto situation is interesting to look at. We can see elements of resistance, and I'll talk about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and some other things later. But in the ghettos, Jews figured out how to, they created a black market. But even beyond that, Zhernikov himself was very worried about giving the residents of the ghetto some element of normalcy and even creativity. They sponsored plays and operas and orchestras and artistic endeavors of various kinds. They wanted to make sure that people kept their connection to humanity and to civilization. They tried to keep schools going, or rather, they created schools. The Nazis were not interested in this, and in fact tried to discourage it, and even outlaw it in some cases. And they created these underground schools where they tried to teach their children, and not just religious things. Of course, to the study of their religious texts, but in addition to that, all sorts of subjects, math and literature and history and these other things. And so I really admire, always have, the commitment that these leaders and frankly so many people had in these ghettos. We can see the absolute debasement of humanity to the extreme, maybe to an extreme that has been realized only a few other times in human history. But at the same time, we can see real heroism and real resistance to this hellish situation that the Jews were forced into, even in a figure like Adam Janjakov. Now, there are other, of course, every ghetto had a Judenrat, and we can also compare, the actions of the different Jewish leaders. One of the things that Janjakov himself does is he talks about he had some association. It seems the Nazis brought together the leaders of the Jewish councils in different ghettos at times. Janjakov had some interaction with the leader of the Łódź ghetto, whose name was Chaim Rumkowski. And Rumkowski was a very different type of leader. He actually fancied himself a kind of king. Some even called him King Chaim. He rode around in a car. He had coins minted with his face on them. If you take the time to look up Chaim Rumkowski and even to study about this a little bit, the famous Holocaust survivor, author Primo Levi writes at some length on Rumkowski and talks about, can we judge a figure like this who seems to be acting largely out of selfishness and even out of a kind of narcissism that's disgusting. But given the impossible situation that he was in, can we judge him for some of the things that he did, right? Zhernikov is more palatable. I mean, he has to make terrible, terrible decisions, but he always does this with a tremendous amount of trepidation and really takes the guilt on himself and, of course, ultimately commits suicide. Now, the ghettos, many people died in the ghettos, and there are eyewitnesses to this, apart from the diaries. I mean, Zhernikov and others talk about, seeing dead bodies in the street. There was a member of the Polish resistance, and this guy's one of my heroes. His name was Jan Karsky, and he became part of a kind of secret organization, espionage group under the Allies. He was a member of the Polish resistance, but he escaped to the West. He was sent back to Poland to document and to observe the conditions there. And one of the things he did was to sneak into, I can't imagine even trying to do this, but sneak into the Łódź ghetto. And Karsky wrote at some length about his experience and how horrific it was. And, just seeing people literally dying in front of his eyes because they didn't have enough to eat and because many of them had just given up hope. Karsky later managed to sneak into some work camps. He thought initially that he had made it into the extermination camp called Belzec, but he determined later he probably hadn't made it there. It was a kind of external work camp associated. Most of these extermination camps or death camps had a kind of network of sub-camps. He was probably in one of the sub-camps, but Karsky even managed to observe some of what was going on in the camps. And so, we have these corroborating sources that detail all of the atrocities committed and the absolute horrific conditions that the Jews were living in these ghettos. And it wasn't just Jews either. In some cases, the Romani people, the Gypsies, were sent into the ghettos. There were whole ghettos created for them, or portions of the ghetto that were given to, or the Romani were forced into. And so, I mean, all of this is going on at the same time. But the ghetto experience lasted in Poland for about 3 years, 2.5 to 3 years before most of the Jews who had lived in the ghettos at one time or another were taken off to the death camps. And that was really, it seems, the goal the Nazis had, especially after the Wannsee Conference, which I'll talk about a little bit later. One important happening at the same time, this is early 1940 that this thing is put into effect. And this is not specifically about the Jews, but it does bear on the experience of the Jews. So I need to mention it in conjunction with the Holocaust because it's part of it. Aktion T4, or actually, the T4 program, was a massive euthanasia program introduced in Germany. It's called T4 after the building in Berlin, actually in suburban Berlin, that the headquarters were housed in, which was Tiergartenstrasse 4, or Tiergarten Street 4, house number 4, right? That's why it's called T4. Anyway, but this was a program, like I said, of euthanasia, where they rounded up all of the disabled people who, according to Nazi kind of racial ideology and biological ideology, were a drag on the society, on the state, who didn't deserve to live. And these were not, primarily Jews. These were Germans. And ultimately, the T4 program ended up killing somewhere around 300,000 or 400,000 people over the course of its life. And I mean, that in and of itself is absolutely horrific. But one of the ways that this bears on the Nazi Holocaust, on the Jewish Holocaust specifically, was that they did this by gassing people to death, right? So they used poison gas, and that innovation, of course, would impinge on the Jewish experience later in the extermination camps. Now, after defeating Poland and kind of calling it a halt, due to the pact that Germany had with the Soviet Union, they bided their time a bit, 2-3 months before they ended up attacking Western Europe. But over the course of 1940, the Nazis ended up conquering much of Western Europe, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, even into Norway. Sweden remained neutral during the war. Finland was actually allied with the Nazis because their greatest enemy was the Soviet Union. But and this is where we can get into the differences between countries and the way that they participated in the Holocaust. There have been a number of very good books written about this, about different countries, about France, about Denmark, about the Netherlands, about Norway. One of my teachers in graduate school, Gunnar Paulson, had written a book on, or at least several articles, given that he was of Scandinavian backgrounds, on Norway and the Holocaust and kind of the role that it played. But we can see various levels of what we might call collaboration. That's commonly the term that's used here. And some of this is a bit surprising, right? So France was divided into two parts. The northern part of France, including Paris, was incorporated directly into the Reich, into Nazi Germany. The southern part of France was put under the rule of a German-friendly government called the Vichy government. It's ruling from the town of Vichy. So there's a difference between the Jewish experience in the northern part of France, which was directly administered by Germany, and the Jewish experience in the southern part of France. And even though the Vichy government was a collaborationist government in the sense that they were friendly with the Germans, they sided with them, so to speak, really were coerced in deciding with them, but they collaborated. But the Vichy government did. The Jews living in Vichy France were protected, so to speak, far more than Jews in the northern part of France, right? And so the Jews their civil rights were taken away, but French Jews were not put into concentration camps. Non-French Jews, so immigrant Jews who were living in Vichy France, were put into concentration camps that were administered though by French guards. However, once things started to once the war started to take certain directions, the Nazis took a more direct hand in the government of Vichy France, and in that case, these Jews who had escaped, for the most part, these French Jews who had been protected by the Vichy government were rounded up and sent off to Auschwitz. But many Jews in France managed to survive because they weren't singled out necessarily for being put into camps or exterminated. Italy, even more than France, refused to hand over their Jews. But in other places that were allied with the Nazis, like Romania, which, for whatever reason, far more anti-Semitic or whatever, the Romanian Jews were handed over, so to speak, for execution, for mass extermination to the Nazis. And so very few Romanian Jews managed to survive the Second World War, and the same went for the countries of the Balkans, which were not allied with Germany, but Germany took them over. And so the occupation of the Balkans was more directly administered by Germany, and the Jews who were living in places like Croatia and Serbia and Bosnia were killed almost entirely, and Greece for that matter. Okay. And so, Jews would move from one place to another, probably hearing rumors or reports that, some places under Nazi occupation or during the war were more friendly to Jews than others. There were a lot of Jews who kind of went from northern France into Vichy France, and then once Vichy France was taken over, into Italy. Once Germany directly took over Italy after the Allied invasion of Italy, then the Jews were kind of caught there. It was at this point that many of the Italian Jews who had previously not been, they had been persecuted in a way, but they were not singled out for either concentration or extermination. Most of the Italian Jews were at that point, this was 1944 or late 1943, taken by the Nazis directly and shipped off to Auschwitz. And this is where, Primo Levi, maybe the most profound and famous of all of the Holocaust survivor authors. He was an Italian Jew. He was secular, agnostic. He was a chemist, so he was a scientist. He was taken off to Auschwitz and managed to survive 11 months in Auschwitz before the camp itself was liberated. But also under occupation, the Jews were at times protected. In the Netherlands, for instance, and a few other places, there were a lot of Christians willing to protect Jews, even to protest the Nazi attempts to persecute and exterminate them. This is where someone like Anne Frank, who was pictured here at the top right of the slide, comes in. Her family was originally from Germany. When the Nazis came to power, they immigrated, and they eventually made their way to the Netherlands, and ended up being, holed up in the upper part of a building that had formerly belonged to a business that Otto Frank had worked for, or that he had been a partner in. And Anna Frank and her family lived there for months, I think a year and a half or something like that. I should have looked that up. But they were eventually betrayed. Someone ratted them out, and the Nazis eventually came for them, and most of them ended up dying in concentration camps. Anna and her sister, whose name escapes me at this point, died in, I believe, either Ravensbrück or Bergen-Belsen. maybe. Anyway, Otto Frank is the only, her father was the only member of the family who survived the camps. And her diary, though, was found later in the early 1950s and became a kind of international sensation as Anne Frank became the, in a way, the face of the Holocaust, right? This innocent, creative, lively Jewish girl, very secular in many ways in outlook. She falls in love with this boy who was in hiding with them, right, and all of that. She really captured people's imagination starting in the 1950s, and there have been multiple films made about her, of course, a stage adaptation of her diary and all of that, right? So, for whatever reason, she's really been an important figure, and she was part of this kind of Western European Jewish experience during the war. One of the groups singled out for a great deal of criticism was the Catholic Church. And, like all other groups, the Catholic experience was mixed. In Poland, in particular, Catholic priests were often very heroic in hiding Jews, saving them, helping transport them across occupation lines. Many Polish priests died in the process. I was some years ago in Krakow, for instance, and one of the things that really stood out to me there was in the churches in Poland, you see often monuments to these priests who were killed by the Nazis because they were trying to aid Jews and aid people in their community who had been singled out for persecution of whatever stripe by the Nazis. But on the other hand, Pope Pius XII never specifically made any public proclamation condemning the Nazis for their persecution of the Jews. And this is one of the things that really has led to a lot of criticism of the Catholic Church and of Pius XII in particular. There's some things that Pius does after the war, too, that are a bit dyspeptic to people. It seems that his primary concern was the protection of Rome and of Catholic property in Italy, and he was maybe more concerned about the possibility that Soviet Russia might make their way into Italy and compromise Catholic position, given how their kind of avowed policy of anti-religious policies. And so, for these reasons, Pius XII seems to, sort of tried to balance between not angering the Nazis and yet not condoning per se what they were doing, right? Which is maybe why he never made any specific public pronouncement about this. But that has, it's disturbed a number of people. We had some years ago at Flagler College a fine scholar, Father Kevin Spicer, who has done work on priests during the Third Reich and shown that many, and this is not to say the majority or anything like that, but many Catholic priests actually did collaborate with the Nazis and even kind of were on board with Nazi racial sentiments and were actively involved in the persecution of the Jews. And Spicer's also talked about Pius XII and seemed himself to be quite critical of the actions of Pius XII. So that's still a legacy within the Catholic Church that is troubling to many. This map gives you a sense of how this whole system began to work. You can see, for instance, the dividing line between the Soviet occupation zone of Poland and the German occupation zone here, right? This doesn't necessarily give you a good sense of how Germany governed Poland. I guess it does. So you have these words here called the Reichsgau. The whole northern part of Poland here, right up to just north of Warsaw, but including Łódź down here, was all incorporated directly into the Reich. into Germany and administered directly. This territory down here was put under the governorship of a Nazi official named Hans Frank, and became part of what was called the general government, which is really just this rump state of Poland. And the largest number of Jews were in the general government. And then after Operation Barbarossa, after the Germans attacked the Soviet Union, they come into possession of all of this territory as well, with all of the Jews who lived in that part of Poland, and all the way up here to, well, to Lithuania. This is Vilnius, or Vilno as it says here. But these were all incorporated into the system. But you can see all of these places with the red circle with the Star of David on them. These are where the ghettos were. And the largest ghettos were Łódź, Warsaw, Krakow, Lvov, which had been in Soviet territory, and Białystok and Vilnius. But also here's Lublin. Here's anyway, these other towns in Poland all had ghettos in them. And in the, well, starting in about 1941 or so, but really ramping up in 42 and 43, and kind of running their course by the middle of 43, were these death camps, right? And, the Jews went to whatever death camp was most proximate to them for the most part. And so the Jews of Warsaw were sent to Treblinka. The Jews of Białystok were sent to Treblinka. The Jews of Łódź were sent to Chełmno. The Jews down here in Lublin and these other places went to either Belzec or Majdanek or Sobibor, right? So these are the most important death camps. But by far the largest ultimately was Auschwitz-Birkenau, and the Jews of Krakow and Jews from other places tended to be sent to Auschwitz because it was the most proximate of all of the death camps to the communities outside of Poland, right? And so we have this whole network of death camps. And a death camp is really just that. It's a place where Jews were killed. And not just Jews. There were, others in the camps. You had homosexuals and Jehovah's Witnesses and political prisoners. Though, for the most part, in the death camps, this is not where the political prisoners were sent. They were sent to work camps. And there were often these camps would have whole networks. There might be a work camp and then an extermination camp in proximity to each other. In Auschwitz, or in the Polish city of Oswiecim, which is the German version of that is Auschwitz, there was a work camp, and then there was also a death camp. The work camp is called Auschwitz I. The death camp is called Auschwitz II, or also called Birkenau. And this ultimately became the largest of all these death camps, a true kind of killing and processing of dead bodies machine almost, by 1943 and all through 1944 until it was liberated, until it was abandoned, I should say, at the end of 1944. The other death camps, Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor, Belzec, Chełmno, these saw their largest amount of traffic in, as I said earlier, 1942 and early 1943, and they were mostly dismantled after that. After they had, killed these Jews by putting them into gas chambers and things, they ended up kind of dismantling the camps because they had done their work, so to speak. The vast majority of all of the Jews who had been part of these ghettos were now killed, and they were no longer necessary, and any of them who remained were being sent to Auschwitz for the most part. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. Much changes with Operation Barbarossa. So starting in June of 1941, the Soviet Union breaks the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They attack the Soviet Union. All of this, of course, with the express purpose of creating Lebensraum for the German people, who had to spread out at the expense of the inferior Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe. And the German army moved quickly. They were really successful in the early phases of the Operation Barbarossa, chewing up huge amounts of German territory, and sorry, of Russian territory, I should say, and heading for key centers where, so one of the places that so they besieged Leningrad, or of course what is now called St. Petersburg, what had been previously called St. Petersburg. They besieged Moscow, actually took over Moscow, part of Moscow. But the areas in southern Russia were maybe even more important to them. The weather was better there for one, but this gave them access to many of the resources that existed in the Caucasus region, especially. There were large oil deposits in the southern part of Russia. And one of the things that was always motivating the Germans during the war was to try to get resources. Right, this is the main reason why they were fighting in the Middle East, for instance, was to try to get to the Arabian Peninsula to take advantage of the oil deposits there. That the war machine that they had demanded oil, right, and they were hamstrung to some extent, and so getting to the natural gas and oil fields of southern Russia was important to them, and this is why they end up in Stalingrad, which is maybe the most important battle in the entire war. And this is not a course on World War II, so we don't need to get into kind of the strategies going on here. But to suffice it to say that the Wehrmacht, or the German army, swallowed up massive amounts of Soviet territory, and this put them into possession of several more million Jews. There were maybe a couple of million Jews living in Soviet territory, in addition to the Jews who were living in Soviet-occupied Poland, and most of these lived in Shtetls. Some of them lived in cities like Kiev or other places. But many of them lived in small villages or small towns. And it's now that the Wehrmacht was spread out so widely, they to try to concentrate Jews into ghettos all over this massive territory that the Nazis now controlled was really impractical. They wanted to exterminate them, and so they came up with increasingly innovative ways of doing that, right? And this starts out really with these mobile killing squads called Einsatzgruppen. Special squads is what that means simply in German. And these were auxiliaries of the army, or increasingly police forces shipped in from cities in Germany, often working together with native auxiliaries, with Russians, with Poles, with Lithuanians, with Ukrainians. They, tried to identify people who shared their anti-Semitic feeling, and they would be ordered to go into villages where there were large numbers of Jews, to force them to congregate, and initially to march them out into the woods and shoot them en masse. And so it would often happen, the Jews would be forced to dig a trench, and then they would line them up at the trench and shoot them, so that they would fall into the trench. Once they had done this to everyone, once they had completely killed the whole community of Jews, they would simply cover over the trench and move on to the next assignment, right? And this is how these Einsatzgruppen operated all through late 1941 into 1942. But there were some issues that these Einsatzgruppen were having with this method of killing. One, it wasn't very efficient. Two, the sound of gunshots would often, prompt people to run and create a chaotic situation. And maybe most concerning to them was that, often shooting these mass numbers of people, the Einsatzgruppen themselves would end up covered with blood and brain matter and, viscera of their victims. And this was taking, this sort of morbidly and horribly ironic, but they were worried about their psychological state, right? That this was hurting their psychology, and so they wanted to come up with a more impersonal way to exterminate the Jews. And so they started using trucks and vans where they would pipe in the carbon monoxide into the back of these vans, so they would herd as many Jews as they could possibly fit into these vans, drive around for an hour or so until all of the Jews in the back had become asphyxiated, and then they would take them out, bury them, and grab the next community of Jews and herd them into the vans and do the same thing, right? So they don't have to see them or participate in their death directly. It's these Einsatzgruppen who become the subject of a number of important studies. Maybe the most famous of these was done by an American historian of the Holocaust, Christopher Browning, who wrote a book called Ordinary Men, where he looks at the makeup of one of these Einsatz, of a specific special squad, which was staffed largely by career policemen from Hamburg. And one of the things that's puzzling about this was there's not a terribly Nazified city. None of these guys were members of the Nazi Party. They didn't necessarily show a proclivity toward racism or anything like that. Yet they participate. They didn't only participate, they eventually willingly accepted assignments to carry out mass extermination of Jews. And of course, one of the questions that Browning asks in this book is, why would these people who don't seem inclined to become cold-blooded killers and were not really won over by Nazi ideology, why do they end up killing so many people and so willingly doing this? And he gets into group psychology. He brings in these various psychological experiments that have been done. Anyway, it's a book I think that anyone interested in this should read. It's kind of a classic now. It was written about 30 years ago or so. But in any case, that's that's the subject of a good deal of scholarship, is the psychology of the killers and trying to get into why people became willing to do such horrible things. Given the reality of now possessing millions of Jews with a kind of piecemeal approach to their concentration and extermination, there was no centralized plan necessarily. There had been a lot of discussion about this. Some Nazi officials had talked about mass immigration of Jews, like forcing them out of Europe. Once they defeated France, they came into possession of all of France's colonial territory. They thought about sending the Jews off to Madagascar. None of these things seemed terribly practical, though, and there was a lot of debate about this. And so if we can find a smoking gun for the mass extermination of the Jews anywhere, it's in this meeting in January 1942, January 30th, I believe it is, 1942, at a place called Wannsee, which is a suburb of Berlin. And there were not any really highly ranking Nazi officials at this meeting. Rather, they were the subordinates of the high-ranking officials, right? So Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the SS, was not there directly. The one who presided over this meeting was Reinhard Heydrich, who was one of Himmler's kind of underlings. He was an important official within the SS, but not one of the kind of core leadership necessarily. Another member of the SS who attended the meeting was Adolf Eichmann, who would become notorious for a number of things that resulted from this. But it was at the Wannsee Conference that the so-called Endlösung, or the final solution to the Jewish question, was put into effect. And the final solution for the Nazis was a centralized operation of transportation and mass killing. And Adolf Eichmann was the one from this meeting ultimately tasked with all of the logistics of this, right? And so the plan went something like this, okay? If we go back to the last slide, that Auschwitz would be expanded dramatically, and specifically the Birkenau, or the death camp part of Auschwitz, would be created, would be expanded to accommodate huge influxes of Jews shipped from all over Europe. That trains would be specifically set aside for the transportation of Jews from all occupied areas of Europe, and that they would go to this central killing location, and that Jews would then be wiped out at Auschwitz. Right. So that's, I mean, there's more to it than that, but that's kind of those are the essentials of the Endlösung, or the final solution. And so this is why Auschwitz becomes so notorious, right? That something around 1.5 million to 2 million Jews ultimately were killed in Auschwitz, in addition to lots and lots of others. The Jews were not the only kind of people, of course. The Nazis were interested in exterminating the Romani, and others were also killed at Auschwitz. So Eichmann was tasked with figuring out, how many trains would be needed to transport the numbers of Jews from such and such a place to Auschwitz, to figure out the routing of these trains to that place. And what is really curious, and, well, all of this is disturbing, but especially disturbing is that the Nazis often used trains that they would decommission trains from the use of the Wehrmacht, and reroute them from taking supplies to the front lines of the war in Eastern Europe, to transport Jews over long distances to Auschwitz. This is not, and so they were going against what probably should have been, at least from a certain point of view, their self-interest. This is the point. This is all happening at the point at which the war starts to turn against the Germans. The Battle of Stalingrad, takes place in late 1942, early 1943, and the German army there is enveloped, surrounded by the Soviets, and they're not routing supply. No, I mean, they're not using all possible trains to route supplies to the army to try to break out this contingent of like 1/3 of a million German soldiers who were caught and completely surrounded by the Soviets. Instead, they're taking a lot of these trains and shipping Jews off to Auschwitz, right? And that's strange to think about why they're doing this. This, I think, again, crystallizes the notion that killing Jews was for many Nazis at least, the uppermost priority, right? That they wanted to make sure that this got done, even if this compromised in some way their ability to win the war. And so, the mass killing proceeded at an ever-increasing pace, starting in 1942. Transport trains, the liquidation of ghettos. It's in June 1942 that Adam Janjakov, after receiving the order to ship off several thousand children from the ghetto probably to Treblinka, that's the place where most of the Warsaw community went, killed himself rather than carry out that order. But ghetto liquidation happened. Frequently, that they would make demands of the Judenrat that a certain number of your community need to be put onto trains and sent away, and the numbers in the ghettos began to decrease as a result of this. The ones who were left were those who were considered essential workers, and increasingly, almost entirely men. And young men, that the elderly and the children and, a larger number of women certainly then were kept in the ghettos, were taken away, shipped off to the death camps. Talked about Auschwitz-Birkenau already. The German industrial firms were tasked with assisting in coming up with increasingly efficient ways to kill Jews. Maybe the most notorious example of this is the German chemical firm IG Farben, IG Farben, that produced on an industrial scale this chemical compound called Zyklon B, which is really just hydrogen cyanide. But they would, ship these capsules off, or they produce these in mass numbers, and these were taken then to Auschwitz, and this is what they used in the gas chambers. They would drop these hydrogen cyanide pellets in there, and this cyanide gas would then asphyxiate all of the people in these. They called them, they were made to look like showers, right? So they were herded in there, and the camp experience, the death camp experience, is, if it's possible to sort of classify it this way, maybe the most horrific of all of the chapters of the Holocaust. Because, again, the Nazis themselves didn't do this by and large. They tasked prisoners to carry out the mass killings. And so, maybe the most wretched of all of the victims of the Holocaust were these people called the Zonder Commandos, the special squads of inmates who were given the responsibility of herding huge numbers of their fellow religionists, and these were not always Jews. Often they were political prisoners or others, but in many cases they were Jews, herding them into these industrial gas chambers, and carrying out the gassing of them, and then disposing of their dead bodies by, opening up the doors, letting it air out, grabbing all of these dead bodies and shoving them into the crematoria, which were connected to them. Auschwitz ended up having 5 crematoria. 2 of these huge and industrial, others were more kind of ad hoc. But when it was operating at its fullest capacity in mid-1944 with the liquidation of the Hungarian Jewish community, all 5 of these crematoria were so busy that they couldn't even deal with the mass numbers of Jews who were being transported there, and so they had open pit fires in many cases to burn the bodies. One of the other most famous texts from the Holocaust is the memoir of Elie Wiesel, who eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986. His book called Night, and this is fairly common high school reading, actually. But Wiesel, who was 14 or 15 when his Hungarian Jewish community was liquidated and sent off to Auschwitz, he talks about, when he got into the camps, one of the things he saw was an open pit fire, and he looked in it and he saw babies burning, right? The bodies of babies burning in there. And so the slave labor was not just in the work camps. So there were dozens of these work camps all over the Reich, many of them in Germany, some of them in Poland, some of them in Bohemia or the Czech lands, and other places, where Jews and others were worked, often to death, where they were given meager rations. But some of this labor was employed in the extermination process itself, and that is one of the most wretched chapters in all of this. Can we find resistance? That's one of the great questions, right? One that has captured the imagination of many scholars and also haunted many scholars, that there wasn't a greater level of resistance, and scholars have tried to explain why. Suffice it to say that we can find resistance. Okay, the most spectacular example, of course, is the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April/May 1943. This lasted about 2 to 3 weeks, where the remaining Jews in the ghetto, and there were at this point only a fraction of what there had been, only maybe 100,000 or so left there of the 400,000 to 500,000 who had once occupied the Warsaw Ghetto. But working with the Polish underground and doing things on their own, they managed to procure some weapons and put up a spirited fight against the Nazis. Even ended up killing a few German soldiers, though not very many, only a handful of them. in the process of doing this. Oh, great, okay. Guess I'll allow that. All right, well, I don't know what somebody's doing with another one of my devices. Anyway, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising did inspire a lot of people. It inspired members of the Polish underground to continue the fight against the Nazis. This is, in the opening stages of a mass resistance against Nazi occupation in the city of Warsaw itself, which led to the near complete destruction of that city by the end of the war. But we can find other forms of resistance. The Zonder Commandos, these crematorium ravens, who had the most horrible task of manning the gas chambers. They in October of 1944, just before Auschwitz itself was liquidated, they managed to blow up one of the crematoria, crematorium number 4, this was an act of absolute defiance by the most wretched of all of the victims. I didn't go much into some of the other aspects of the camp, by the way. I wanted to kind of show you some of these pictures, so let me do that at this point. And we can incorporate this into the discussion of resistance, right? So this is the gate of Auschwitz, and you can see the trains would, this is actually Birkenau. So this is the extermination camp. The work camp of Auschwitz is several miles across the town of Auschwitz. But the trains would go into that gate, and the Jews would be unloaded at that point, and they would be separated. Those who were deemed fit for work, which was usually a small fraction of any specific transport, would be sent off to the processing center, which at Auschwitz was called, for whatever reason, was called Canada. I've never learned why they ended up naming it that. But the vast majority of all of the Jews on the transport would then be herded back. And this was not like they were herded directly into the gas chambers. One of the things that struck me maybe most severely when I went to Auschwitz a few years ago for the first time, and thus far the only time actually, was how big this place is. And so from the drop-off point of the trains, it was well more than a mile walk back to the gas chambers. And so, the elderly, the children, most of the women, and, those deemed unfit for work would be forced to walk, in some cases in the snow. And, this after maybe being on a train with no water, no food, packed into these cattle cars for, in some cases, days. If they were coming from France or Italy, it took 3, 4, 5 days to get to Auschwitz with no relief from that situation. So many of them died in the transports. Then they were forced to walk another mile back to the crematoria or back to the gas chambers where they were gassed. They were told these were showers made to disrobe. They went into these supposed showers and were killed. The rest of them taken to Canada would be processed. They were taken in, made to disrobe completely. They were herded into showers where they were sprayed with, some cases with scalding water, in some cases with freezing water. They had to stand there and endure the shower, and in some cases wait wet and frigid for a time. Then they were taken in, given usually a set of shoes. Didn't matter if they fit or anything. One article of clothing. Their heads and all of their body hair was shaved. They were tattooed with a number. And this processing system could take maybe an hour or two to get through all of that, and then they're taken out. Most of their family by this point was gone. They didn't know what had happened to them, and put into this terribly disorienting situation. Could one perpetrate any resistance under such conditions, I ask you? The obvious answer is no. I mean, this is so incredibly disorienting, and all the time, people are shouting at them. The SS guards are shouting at them. The their fellow inmates who were, tasked with administering the processing of the prisoners were shouting at them to do this or do that. They didn't know, where they were going to get their meals, where they were going to sleep, and they sort of had to figure this out. But even in those terrible conditions, even crowded into these barracks, sleeping on boards, packed into these places. If you ended up next to somebody who was sick, they might, vomit all over you or move their bowels at night without being able to help themselves. All of this was absolutely terrible. And even in those sorts of conditions, we find forms of resistance. There are incredible examples of heroism here, where people would keep their, take their food and give it to others who needed it more. There are cases of women who were pregnant, and to be pregnant in a camp was a terrible thing, because if they were found out, they would be immediately gassed and killed. But there are cases, documented cases, where women hid other pregnant women and helped them deliver their babies, and even hid the babies after they were brought into the world. Right? This wasn't common, but these sorts of things did happen. More common probably was that, and this is where some of the debate comes in, that these Jewish inmates would, be forced simply to go into survival mode, into fight or flight mode. That when it was time to eat, they had to claim their food. Right? They had to protect things like their bowl and their shoes and their hat and these things that were necessary for them to survive. If they showed up to a roll call without their hat, they would be shot. If somebody didn't show up to roll call, others would be killed. Right? And so, there had to be, they were forced to have a kind of communal spirit to preserve the lives of everyone, but most especially themselves. Anyway, there's a lot more we could say about that, but we find forms of resistance, I think, in a lot of places. The creation of the black markets in the ghettos and other things, right, are other forms of resistance where the Jews were saying, we are not going to give in. We are going to do our best to survive. Another bright spot, if there is one, in this terrible scene of tragedy is that there were rescuers. There were people, and there's a whole range of people who can be classified as rescuers. Everything from a village peasant in Poland or Lithuania or Ukraine who allowed some Jews to hide in an outbuilding or something for an hour while the Nazis or while the Einsatzgruppen searched the town for all Jews, right? And then made them leave after that. Even that's an act of heroism. There's some really spectacular cases. If you've not seen the film Schindler's List, I would highly recommend it. But that is a story largely of a German industrialist, actually a member of the Nazi Party, whose name was Oskar Schindler, who ended up saving the lives of several hundred Jews who were his factory workers in the factory in Krakow that he established after the beginning of the war. And he created a list of these workers and even managed to spring many of them out of Auschwitz and took them off to a factory in Czechoslovakia that he had direct control over, right? And he gave them higher food rations and did things to protect them. I find the most spectacular example of a rescuer in the person of the one picture at the lower right here, Rao Wallenberg, who is maybe my greatest hero. He's up there with Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King and some of these others anyway. But Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat who was sent by the Swedish government. I remember Sweden was in neutral during the war. They sent him to Hungary in mid-1944. The Hungarian Jewish community was the last large Jewish community left at that point in Eastern Europe. There were maybe 500,000 Jews living in Hungary. And the Hungarian government, which was an ally of Nazi Germany during the war, had at that point protected the Jews and not allowed the Nazis, or not turned them over to the Nazis for extermination. the Nazis took a more direct hand in controlling Hungary in 1944, and at this point they started to ship the Hungarian Jews off to Auschwitz. And over the course of a few months, nearly the entire community of 500,000 were sent off to Auschwitz and killed. Wallenberg was sent there, and he was not the only one. There were Swiss diplomats who were likewise sent there. He was sent there with the permission of the Swedish government to print a few Swedish identity papers and to give these to Jews so they could claim Swedish citizenship and thus be exempt or immune from being liquidated. Well, Wallenberg went well above and beyond that. He printed thousands of these identity papers. He was only given a few hundred. He replicated them and printed hundreds of thousands of these, passed them out to Jews everywhere. He ended up buying a number of houses in the city of Budapest, which he declared Swedish property, and he stuffed as many Jews as he could possibly find into these houses and declared them to be diplomatic zones that were protected, that were property of the Swedish government, and thus should not be tampered with by the Germans. He even, at one point, there was a transport train of Jews being sent out of Budapest, and Wallenberg climbed onto the train with a stack of these identity papers, and the SS guards were shooting as a warning to him, and he continued to hand these identity papers through the bars in the train. And then when the train stopped, he ordered the doors to be opened and the Jews who held these identity papers to be released into his custody because they were Swedish citizens. And it seems that the guards were so awed by his bravery and his chutzpah, his courage, that they gave in to this. And there are all sorts of stories told about Wallenberg. Some of them probably more legendary than anything. He is the one great example, though, of a rescuer who directly confronted the SS in the act of trying to liquidate Jews. Right. And he is directly responsible for the rescue of several thousand Jews. I don't know that there's a good way to put a number on this. Estimates range anywhere from 5,000 to, if you include all the people he indirectly may have helped, maybe as many as like 100,000, right? Though he wasn't necessarily directly responsible for rescuing 100,000 Jews. But several thousand Jews owed their lives at the end of the war to Rao Wallenberg, one of whom I have some direct personal interaction. Well, not with him directly, but I was had a classmate at Oxford in my program whose grandfather had been a Hungarian Jew in Budapest and ended up in one of Wallenberg's safe houses with these identity papers. And after the war, with almost no family left, he was a teenager, went off to the United States as a refugee and ended up initially in Seattle, later got a PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and then became a U.S. congressman in California. His name was Tom Lantos. And his granddaughter was one of my classmates, right? So I heard lots and lots of stories about him, about Wallenberg, who, of course, this family absolutely venerated, understandably so. I visited Wallenberg's monument in Budapest some years ago. One of the most profound experiences of my life. I cannot tell you how many emotions I had on that occasion, having learned about this guy. But I think Wallenberg is somebody we should learn more about, right? The street that the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. is called Rao Wallenberg Way, and so there is some kind of public recognition of him, but not nearly as much as he deserves. Unfortunately, he was taken prisoner by the Soviets at the end of the war, and no one quite knows what happened to him. It seems he ended up in a Soviet gulag and probably died there in the 1950s. But in any case, that's part of the story of Wallenberg, the unfortunate end there of him. Right, just a couple more points here. The final days of the war, we talked about the Hungarian Jews. As the Soviet army crept closer and closer, the camps began to be liquidated, and rather than simply release the Jews at that point, the Germans were determined to hold on to them, and so they forced them onto these death marches. In some cases, forcing them to, and these are people who are nearly starving to death already and in poor health, forced them to run or march in some cases for 50 miles or more per day, and just moving further and further west away from the war front, and in this way, the camps in the east were liberated by the Soviet army, but the camps in Germany ended up becoming crowded with those who would survive the death marches. And the death marches may have killed upwards of 250,000 Jews alone, as these Jews who were completely exhausted and emaciated just, stopped and were either killed by the Nazi guards or just perished on the side of the road. When the camps were liberated, this was a kind of international scandal. Not that the Allies didn't know what was happening there. They had plenty of reports from people like Jan Karsky about what they had seen, but the images are really stark. And the American and British and Soviet armies took footage of the camp inmates. Right, we can see these starving, emaciated people. This shot down here is General Eisenhower looking over a pile of bodies that had been burned to ash, or nearly to ash, in the camps. And so the liberation of the camps really woke up the whole world to what had been going on. But in reality, the writing was on the wall, and in many cases, these Allied governments had direct knowledge of what had been happening there, but they had not taken direct action. And this is another point of debate within Holocaust studies. Like, should the Americans and the British have taken more direct steps to halt the killing? Should they have bombed the train lines going to Auschwitz? Should they have bombed the camps themselves, right? Bomb the gas chambers to make sure that this killing machine could not continue? And, there are scholars and others who have weighed in on multiple sides of that debate. I don't want to get into that necessarily here, but just be aware that that is a point of contention. After the war, there were thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees trying to flee Europe, displaced, put in displaced person camps. Thousands of them boarded ships to try to get to Israel. The British blockaded Palestine at that point, as we talked about in an earlier lecture, and in many cases, prevented these Holocaust survivors from making it to Palestine. There was even conflict, like on the ship called the Exodus. The British soldiers boarded that, and ended up fighting with the refugees on that ship. And so, this is another to add to another disturbing chapter to all of this. In the couple of years after the war, the Allies held trials for Nazi war crimes, and all of the kind of chief Nazi officials either committed suicide or died in prison right after the war. But often camp commandants and others, were taken into these trials, which were held in the German city of Nuremberg. And more evidence about all of this came to light, though many Nazis escaped, right? A further chapter was added to this in 1961 and this is after the establishment of the State of Israel, which we'll talk about later, but in 1961, Israeli kind of covert operators found Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution, we might say, the logistics man of the final solution, and in secret deported him to Israel. He went on trial in Jerusalem. This trial was broadcast internationally. And Eichmann made his defense to say, essentially, well, I was given orders and I carried them out, right? What was I supposed to do? I was a functionary. I was a cog in the wheel. And Hannah Arendt, the mid-20th century philosopher of some renown and commenter on totalitarianism, wrote a famous book about this, which is really just a collection of her kind of articles that she wrote while sent there as a reporter on the Eichmann trial. She labeled this whole this whole sequence of events, gave it the title "The Banality of Evil." Right, that evil is not, a fire-breathing dragon or the image of Satan from Dante's Inferno or something like that. It's a sniveling bureaucrat who, is putting together timetables of trains, of transports of these Jews, and is working from the comfort of an office, ordering around or orchestrating the deaths of millions of innocent people, right? This is all banal. And that, that in and of itself is really quite disturbing. Final observations on the Holocaust. I don't know much else that needs to be said beyond the Holocaust is mass murder on a scale rarely seen in human history, with an intent that is nothing other than evil. That even if someone like Eichmann can claim to just be a kind of cog in a large machine, right? The intent of this was to carry out the mass murder of all the Jews. And we can never lose sight of that. Talk about whatever issues we will, right? We can never lose sight of the fact that this is all about murder, that this was the killing of innocent people on a huge scale, on a tragic scale, and it's something that everyone should know about, difficult though though the subject matter is, right? So hopefully this has been a fitting exposure to this. I know that many of my students, especially if they've taken a number of my classes, have already had some training on the Holocaust, and sorry if this has been emotionally difficult for you, but I think it's necessary to encounter these emotionally difficult subjects. So hopefully you've been able to comprehend kind of the scope of this and the way that it happened, and that this is something that you will not forget, right? That we will learn, in this case especially, the lessons of history to make sure that we see when there is murderous intent on whatever scale, and that the conditions that created the Holocaust must be understood, and we must take steps to make sure that when these things happen, and I say when and not if, because they have happened repeatedly even after all of this, right? Cambodia, Rwanda, Darfur, other examples of more recent genocides, that we take action. So thank you. If you have any questions or comments, please post them to the discussion board or email me directly. I'd be happy to talk more at length about this.